Yeah, so John Winston's going to give us a talk next about pay for performance for pollution mitigation. Obviously, from what we've heard from Don Besch, we need more innovation in the policy sector as well to make effective progress in mitigating diffuse nutrient pollution from phosphorus and nitrogen. And so John has been leading some of this work. He's got a lot of experience as an agriculture and environmental economist. And hopefully he's able to be heard. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, John, so you can take over.
Okay. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Great.
Fine.
Great.
Feel free to turn on your camera if you'd like.
I will do that.
And take it away.
Let's see. Okay. Let me start by an advanced apology. I have a limited bandwidth from my home office, and I was trying to connect by phone, but I can't unmute myself by the phone. So we'll hope the audio and at least the audio will work well from here. I appreciate the opportunity to take part in this forum. And I want to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing over the last 10 or so years related to pay for performance conservation to reduce phosphorus primarily from ag land. We've started also to work in nitrogen to a lesser degree. And so I hope this will be a good follow-on to some of the information that's been presented already. Let me share my screen. One moment.
Looks like it's starting.
Okay. You guys can see my intro slide there?
That's good.
Great. Sorry, there we go. Okay, hold on one second. Sorry, let me just get back to my, okay. So I'm going to try to go through this rather quickly, but just to give you guys some context, the current approach to agricultural nutrient control is basically a pay for practice approach. It's a cost sharing, best management practices on farms. Essentially farmers implement specific practices, best management practices, and then they're reimbursed a portion of the cost. There's different names for these, but it makes sense because it's very hard to measure and monitor the amount of nutrient loss at the edge of every field or down through the soil profile. But when you pay for practice, and you're not focused on the outcome, you don't know how much phosphorus you're losing from each field, and you can't make informed business decisions as a farmer on what to do. So USDA spends across the country over $5 billion a year on conservation programs. So there's a lot of money already in the system. And the reason we're working on this is to try to improve the cost effectiveness of these dollars being spent. However, there's a lot of private sector efforts also to reduce nutrient loss from ag land, and those generally would take on some kind of pay for performance approach, I would hope and think. So as I said, the field-specific outcomes aren't quantified in the current approach, and this really leaves farmers out of the loop. They're not motivated to try to solve the problem. They're asked to implement a specific practice, and hopefully often they do. Sometimes they prefer not to. It's all voluntary. But it doesn't harness farmers' innovative and problem-solving skills to help solve the problem. So if the landscape weren't diverse and nutrient loss and the reduction of nutrient loss by best management practices, BMPs, were constant, I think pay for practice would be absolutely fine. But the landscape is very diverse, and the performance of any given BMP is highly variable. So field-specific information is essential if we want to get at cost-effective solutions. So this approach that we've been working with for quite some time now, which we call pay for performance conservation, it has some other names, but it's all essentially the same, based on the same idea. What happens, the way we work on it, it really starts here in number 2, that models are used to predict how much phosphorus is leaving a field or entering a stream, and how much reduction you could get by implementing different BMPs or sets of BMPs on that specific field. So we produce information with those models and then provide that information to farmers, and they hopefully implement the most appropriate and cost-effective strategies for their farm. And then they're paid based on the modeled farm level results. So, the payments are based on estimated outcomes from specific fields for different scenarios that the farmer might be interested in doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about this process in a minute. Why are we doing pay for performance conservation? Essentially, it addresses a market failure condition, right? The loss of the phosphorus from the farm, although it can be and has been argued that it is in the best interest of the farmers not to lose it because it has value for them. The problems that emerge downstream, whether it's locally or all the way in the Gulf of Mexico or the Chesapeake Bay, those problems are external to the farmers' decision making, right? And there's no prices for them to line up against to compare to the costs of trying to reduce those losses. So there's market failure there. Pay for performance conservation can help to motivate farmers in a couple of ways. One, it creates specific goals. And there might not be a phosphorus loss reduction goal for a farm, but if you're getting paid per pound of phosphorus loss reduction, ideally you want to reduce as many pounds as you can up until the point where your payment is no longer greater than the cost. And in doing this, it can increase farm profits. So there's an economic motivation as well as a sort of a human motivation aspect to it. And just in general, to quantify the outcomes. We heard about the TMDL in the Chesapeake Bay. I neglected to say that I'm based in northwestern Vermont near the shores of Lake Champlain, where there's also significant phosphorus loading problems in parts of the lake. And there is a TMDL in place. And in places like this, we absolutely need to be quantifying the outcomes, and we need to be doing it on a field-specific basis. So this helps us along that route. Cost-effective outcomes are a lot more likely in this kind of situation where we're producing the information for good business decision-making. To talk briefly about key program design questions, I want to talk about what ecosystem services do we target with pay for performance conservation? In our work, it's been primarily phosphorus. And in this forum, we're concerned primarily about phosphorus. We have started to work with nitrogen more recently, as I mentioned. Another important question is, how do we quantify the environmental performance? And this question really is about modeling versus measurement. And measurement could include some kind of proxy variables that are more readily and easily measurable than the ambient environmental condition or the loss of nutrients from the field. And then where do we quantify the performance? And this could be, Don talked about the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So if we asked farmers in Iowa, if we told them we would pay them some amount of money if in that year the area or the volume of the hypoxic zone were to decrease, I don't think any farmers would actually do anything differently, right? Because there's so many confounding sources that it makes it impossible to see the direct link between the farmer's decision making and the outcome. At the other end of the spectrum, you could be right at the farm level with modeling or measurement. And in the groups that we've worked with in different places around the country, the consensus is always we have to work at the farm level. And in doing so, we've always been working with modeling also. I'll talk a little bit at the end about how we've tried to link this to monitoring as well. But we need performance measures that are closely related to the ultimate water quality concern. So the nutrient loads in the Chesapeake Bay or into the, where they're manifesting a problem. So if it's in the Gulf of Mexico or anywhere else, it could be locally or regionally or nationally. But we also need to be measuring performance in places that are directly influenced by farm management decisions. So to give you a sense of what we've been doing, we've been working with farmers in areas where we've been able to pilot test this. And we've basically been able to do this with grant funding from USDA, EPA, the Great Lakes Protection Fund, some other foundations. And this picture here, you can see the truck in the background, Iowa State University. So we collaborated with them to work in a few important watersheds in northeastern Iowa. And we have a technician working directly with a farmer, and the technician needs to be trusted by the farmer and needs to understand how those farms work. And this particular guy is a farmer himself and a technician, and really was able to do great work with them. So what we do is we try to identify specific actions for specific fields, and we ask farmers to we don't ask them to talk about the kinds of changes they wouldn't want to make if the price were right. So we basically say, what kind of changes do you think you would be willing to make, if the price were right? And that's helpful, so we don't waste time working on things that they're never going to be interested in. And for each of those scenarios, we estimate the amount of nutrient loss reduction and the cost to the farmer. And we give that information back to the farmer to use in decision making. So we've done this in Iowa, in Vermont, in Wisconsin, in Ohio. Our focus has been on phosphorus primarily. And I said we're mostly using models to quantify the performance. So we've used state phosphorus index tools, SNAP Plus, which is also the Wisconsin phosphorus index tool, NTT, which is the nutrient tracking tool we've recently been using in Ohio. So there's different models. They have their own pluses and minuses for sure. We have tried in our recent work in Ohio to measure ambient stream conditions also, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So as an example, in Ohio, we were recently offering farmers $35 per pound of phosphorus loss reduction that they could produce from their baseline, which is essentially what they had been doing prior to the project coming in. And offering $5 per pound of nitrogen. There's no magic in these numbers. We had small grant-funded programs to pilot test this, and we needed payment rates that were high enough to induce farmers to want to make some changes, and low enough that they didn't break the bank of our grant-funded projects. So what we produce and give to the farmer, the information that we give them for decision making, are generally a bunch of graphs, and then we also give it to them in a table format. But these graphs are nutrient loss reduction for each scenario on each field, the payment that they'll get from the program, and the cost, the full economic cost to them. So when I say full economic cost, what's really important in some scenarios is the opportunity cost. If they're putting in a buffer between the field and the stream, they're taking land out of production, and they're losing potential net income from that. So we need to make sure we've quantified that. And then most importantly, the profit or loss for each scenario. So I'm going to show you some graphs now, and I'm not showing them to you for you to digest the information, because as you'll see, these graphs are hard to read, but just to give you a sense for what it looks like, what we give to the farmer. So the first couple of graphs, the top one is phosphorus loss reduction, and each bar represents a scenario on a specific field. It could be one best management practice selected for that field, or it could be a combination of them. And the bottom graph is nitrogen loss reduction. What's more important to the farmer is this set of graphs that show for these same scenarios, what's the payment they're going to get from the program, what's the total cost to them, and what's the profit or loss. Now, one of the real upsides of using modeling for this is we can do all of this before any change is made. And it takes the uncertainty out of it for the farmer, because no matter what happens with the weather that year, which is obviously going to affect the nutrient losses for that year. So the models are never going to be right until they can predict the weather through the cropping year. But hopefully they're directionally correct and in the ballpark. And that's an important subject. I'm glad we'll be hearing more about modeling after this. But it is great that the farmers can have some certainty. If they do these changes as they've been described on these fields, their payment will be X. They can know that, and we can estimate the cost for them. We hope they'll dig into those numbers to make sure that our estimates of the cost for them are how they see it, and then the profit and loss. And ideally, they would choose the most profitable scenarios first. They don't always do that because there might be other factors in their decision making. So those graphs I was just showing you, this is graphs, these are actual graphs from one farm in Ohio. We put all of these together to look at it from a program perspective. And what's easiest for me to show you are these results from Vermont farms, where we did the same thing on phosphorus. And we offered in Vermont $25 per pound of phosphorus loss. So you can see that horizontal black line at the $25 level. So any of these bars, which again are real scenarios for real farms, any of those bars that are at or below $25 per pound would be good business decisions for the farm to do. They would end up with more in their pocket after doing them and getting the payment than they had before. What's most interesting about this graph is the huge variability. So you can see we've color-coded these according to the category of best management practice, cover crop being in yellow and manure and fertilizer management being in that sort of darker red maroon color. Obviously, there's variation across these categories, but even within a category, there's huge variation. So I want to point out one in particular. You can see that we truncated this graph at $100 per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. So these are the costs per pound to the farmer. If we hadn't truncated it here so that you could see this, this contour, this texture in this graph, this rightmost bar, the yellow bar, would have gone all the way up to $840 something per pound. Why? Well, when we looked more closely at that, the fields that the farmer had thought he could do cover cropping on were not very sloping, and they didn't have high soil phosphorus. So you still had the cost of getting the seed in the ground and killing down the cover crop, but you weren't getting much bang for the buck. The other end of the spectrum for cover cropping is in the middle of the graph here, this yellow one, which came in at $29 per pound. So huge variation. The other thing I'd like to call your attention to is this leftmost bar, which is a fertilizer management option on a farm. And this farmer, for every field he had going into corn, he would put down 200 pounds per acre of a 20-10-10 fertilizer. It's just what he did. The technician working with the farmer came up with the idea that a lot of those fields have high soil phosphorus already, and they don't need that extra phosphorus. So instead of 200 pounds per acre of the 20-10-10, they went down to 50 pounds per acre, and they made up the nitrogen needs with urea, which has no phosphorus in it. And that change saved the farmer a little bit of money. That's why this bar goes into the negative territory. Didn't save them a lot, probably not enough for them to get excited about, but when you add the $25 per pound payment, it sweetened the deal and got the farmer excited about doing that. So this kind of approach can eke out those kind of innovative changes. The next graph I'm going to show you, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's the same kind of thing from our Iowa work. And you'll notice the bars are all a lot shorter. And because they're a lot shorter, we were offering farmers $10 per pound in Iowa instead of 25. And again, these numbers are not magic. They're just what we needed to do in our small projects. To summarize what's going on in these graphs, if the farmers implemented all of the good business decisions, so as I said, all of the scenarios that were below the payment line, where the cost is less than the payment, and no other scenarios, then the summary of those results are here. So in Iowa, the reduction in phosphorus loss would have been getting up near 1 pound per acre per year, and an average savings of 61 cents per pound of phosphorus loss reduction. And with the payment of $10, the farm profit is on average 10.61. In Vermont, it was very different. It was about 1/4 of a pound of phosphorus loss reduction per year per acre at a cost of near $5. We were paying them $25 per pound, so the resulting profit is around $20 per pound. I hope that's clear enough. For the sake of time, I'm just going to go through a few lessons learned and make a couple other points and finish up. Matt, I hope I'm doing okay on time. I'm not actually timing myself.
You're doing great, John. Thanks.
Okay. So one of the main lessons are that there are low-hanging fruit out there, like the win-win situation I described before. There are scenarios that can save farmers some money and reduce phosphorus loss from the land. And those are the low-hanging fruit, and we want to make sure we're taking advantage of those. And it's hard to know those if you're not using a performance-based approach. You don't necessarily even have to have the incentive to pay them, but at least be calculating field-specific results in a way that farmers can see where those low-hanging fruit are. The performance-based pay for performance conservation, or these kind of performance-based incentives, can inspire new ideas and new approaches and harness the farmers' innovation to come up with more cost-effective solutions. What we found is farmer motivation varies quite widely, right? And interestingly, you know, when we introduce a pilot project in a watershed, you can imagine the first farmers who come forward to say, I'd like to participate, are the ones who have been interested in conservation all along and have maybe already plucked the low-hanging fruit from their farm. Generally, there's not the kind of the number of cost-effective changes that those farmers can still make compared to a farmer who hasn't been so involved in conservation. So that didn't seem very fair to us. So we came up with ways to reward farmers for being at some level of phosphorus loss or below it, in addition to paying for reductions. And I think that's important too. As I mentioned before, having good technical assistance, good boots on the ground is essential. The farmers need to trust them, and they need to be giving the farmers good advice. Obviously, this is a information and labor intensive approach, and the transaction costs of working in this way are higher, especially in the early years when you're first calculating the baseline losses for a farm. The transaction costs are higher than in a pay for practice approach. But as long as those transaction costs are less than the program benefits, then I think we benefit in the long run. And models, well, you know, they're really important in the work we're doing. I'm glad we're going to be talking more about them this afternoon. They're necessary, and they're very difficult. Not just complex, but sometimes cause problems for the users. We've had models that haven't reacted consistently, and so we're still developing in that area. And lastly, policy change is slow. As I mentioned, we're trying to get USDA to spend their money differently, and they're starting to do that now, but it's taken a long time. I want to finish up with one other concept. I said I was going to talk about measurement also. So one concept that we came up with is what we call model at the farm, measure at the watershed, pay for performance conservation. So as we talked about before, modeling at the farm and providing incentives for reductions there. But also, ideally, if we could be measuring at the mouth of the watershed, and I don't mean in the Gulf of Mexico or in the Chesapeake Bay, but maybe, you know, at the Huck 12 or even the Huck 14 watershed, where there's a lot of farmers upstream participating, we can give a bonus payment or a secondary incentive to farmers when we move the needle there, because that's really what we need to do. And by doing that, you can get farmers who are participating upstream to maybe talk to other farmers, their neighbors and others who aren't participating, and apply a little peer pressure, which is going to be a lot more powerful than anything coming from the non-farm community. So, it also provides a focal point for change. Farmers want, like all of us, want to be agents of change. And if they can get excited about moving the needle in the stream, in their watershed, they want to do that. So that's a motivating point and gives a real report card, can trigger that secondary incentive payment and give the peer pressure, as I mentioned. So we put this idea forward, and it was one of the 3 winners of the U.S. Nutrient Challenge in 2015. We're still trying to really make it happen on the ground. We're trying it in Ohio, but haven't really been able to detect the signal we want to see there. So that's a problem. Just a little plug for a how-to guide that we put together on pay for performance conservation. I'm happy if anyone wants it to send them a PDF copy. And I'll stop there with my contact info.
Great. Thank you, John. Wow, that was pretty exciting. There was some pretty cool things I hadn't seen before in that presentation. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the forum today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Questions coming in. So Matt, you want to take over?
Yeah, we'll start with Laura Campbell. Hi, Laura. Sorry about my voice there.
Hi, not a problem. John, that was a great presentation, and I'm glad you brought up the pay for performance because in Michigan, we have been trying pay for performance projects in a couple of different watersheds and have had mixed success with them, I think. The modeling on the field-specific practices has been going well. The big pushback that we get is from farmers who, and it could just be that they're more used to the model of, hey, if I put in a practice, I want to get paid for it. But what we hear from them is, hey, it's not fair that I want to do something good, but I'm not going to get paid as much as somebody else in the watershed. And one thing that we get concerned about with that is exactly what you brought up at the end, that farmer peer pressure, that coming from neighbors, coming from, from colleagues, that one of the things that we feel like we risk giving up is the idea of, it's not just the people who are right on the river's edge who are doing it, but if all of your neighbors are doing it, boy, you start to feel that pressure of, I should be doing something good too. And I wonder if you guys have thought about that or have heard some of the same pushback from farmers who say, hey, I want to do something good, but you're not paying me as much and it's not my fault that I'm not right on the river.
Yeah. I mean, there are really important fairness issues, equity versus cost effectiveness. And I think we need to be sensitive to those. There were several issues wrapped up in your observations, Laura, and I appreciate that. When budgets get tight, I mean, I think we need to continue to be focused on cost effectiveness, but also recognize that there are social and human dynamics in agricultural watersheds and among farmers. And we don't want to alienate farmers. The most difficult dynamic is the one I mentioned that I've experienced is when farmers come forward and say, hey, I'd love to do this, but hey, I already voluntarily plucked all my low-hanging fruit. And you're telling me that there's no way for me to make money from this program now because of that? That's not fair. And I agree 100% that's not fair. Yet I also think we need to stay focused on cost-effective reductions. So what I mentioned before is when that was faced with us, we not only were offering farmers a payment for reducing the phosphorus loss from their baseline, but if they were at some level of loss across their farm. So like here in Vermont, if they were below 0.5 pound per acre per year of phosphorus loss across their entire farm, then they got a small per acre payment. And if that loss was down to 0.1 pounds per acre per year across their farm, that per acre payment went up some. So just as a way to sort of, we called it a stewardship payment. You're doing a great job, keep it up, here's a small payment. So it doesn't get you anything new, but it helps. I hope that answers some of your question, Laura.
Yeah, so let's take one more, Matt, and then we'll move on to our next talk. Matt, you're muted.
Sorry, Madeline Fleischer, if you have a quick question for John. You're unmuted now.
Hey, Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, I was curious. So I'm based in Ohio, so my interest was piqued about your comments on your experience there, especially with regards to not really having some of the watershed level signal that you're looking for. And I was wondering, I mean, my non-scientific guess would be that's partly because the precipitation patterns are such a big factor driving that. And I was curious whether, in your experience, you had any farmer feedback on what to do with respect to, part of this is about when you apply and when there's a big rainstorm. Are there any practices emerging to deal with that or to address that as a factor?
Yeah, thanks very much, Madeline. Just to be clear, I mean, really, the reason that the primary reason we weren't able to see a signal in our work in the Old Woman Creek watershed in north central Ohio, goes directly into Lake Erie, is that we weren't able to get the number of farmers and the number of acres enrolled doing the kinds of changes that we wanted to. And to tie it back to my points about the difficulties of modeling, we had terrible difficulties with the model we were using in the early stages. And that seemed to undermine the interest, the confidence by farmers in what we were doing and the interest in it, because it took us several years to sort of work the bugs out of the modeling. So I still want to know if we get enough acres in a watershed in terms of percentage, can we see a signal? And I would hope we can.